Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. They called her a miracle, the sole survivor of a devastating plane crash that claimed hundreds of lives. But survival came with a price. In the weeks after the disaster, as she struggled to rebuild her life, something began following her home every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. Missions, there's a sound. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and then the faint voices, whispers of anger, cries of pain, and questions she can't bear to answer. Why her? Why not them? What started as a haunting presence has grown louder, closer, more demanding. Now she's trapped in a nightmare where the line between life and death blurs. She knows it's only a matter of time before the knocks no longer wait at her door, they step inside. The crash was not a memory. It was a wound that never closed. The screams had stopped long before rescue came, but she still heard them when she closed her eyes. She could still smell jet fuel and burning flesh clinging to her skin, no matter how many showers she took. Reporters called her survival a miracle, her face plastered on every screen for weeks. Headlines screamed "Sole Survivor," as though the words were a crown she should wear with pride. But at night, when the noise of the world faded and she was alone in her apartment, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a mistake. She didn't deserve to be here while hundreds of others had been swallowed by fire and steel. She was not stronger or braver. She was simply left. And in the silence of her bedroom, that thought echoed louder than the explosion that had torn the plane apart. Then, on the 4th night after returning home, the knocking began. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Old buildings made sounds, wood contracted in the cool air, pipes rattled, neighbors came and went. But this wasn't like those harmless house noises. This was intentional. At precisely 2:17 a.m., she awoke to 3 slow, deliberate knocks at her front door. Not pounding, not frantic, calm, patient. Her eyes darted to the glowing red numbers of her bedside clock as the sound echoed in her chest. She didn't move. She couldn't. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on her lungs, pinning her to the mattress. Minutes passed. Her heart pounded in her ears. Then, nothing. Just silence. She stayed like that until dawn, staring at the shadows shifting on her ceiling, waiting for another sound that never came. But she didn't sleep again. The second night, she tried to be brave. She left the hallway light on. She told herself she would check the door this time. At 2:16 a.m., her eyes flew open without warning, as though something had tugged her awake. Her clock ticked over to 2:17. 3 knocks, louder this time. Sharp. Each strike rattled her bones. She sat upright, clutching her blanket, forcing her body to move, even as every cell screamed to stay still. Bare feet touched the cold floor as she crept toward the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, holding her breath. The hallway was quiet, or almost. Just as she was about to step back, a sound came, faint, muffled, dozens of voices whispering all at once, some sobbing, some moaning. some murmuring words too soft to understand. Her stomach turned to ice. She stumbled backward, hand clamped over her mouth, to silence the scream rising in her throat. The third night broke her. The knocks didn't wait for her to wake. They came hard, shaking the door in its frame. 3 times. The voices followed, louder now. Not whispers, words. Angry. Accusing. Why you? Why not us? She lay frozen in her bed, clutching her pillow as tears streamed down her face. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she fumbled for it with shaking hands. A text from an unknown number blinked on the screen. 3 words, open the door. Her fingers went cold. She threw the phone across the room and curled into a ball under her blanket. The air grew colder and heavier as the minutes dragged by. Hours later, when sunlight finally spilled through her curtains, she dared to crawl out. The phone lay cracked on the floor, the screen dark. She didn't tell anyone. She considered staying elsewhere, but some small, stubborn voice inside whispered it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't tied to her apartment. It had followed her from the wreckage. She remembered lying on wet grass that night, staring at the blinking lights of emergency crews as a charred arm brushed her shoulder. At the time, she thought it was her imagination. Now she wasn't so sure. That evening, she dragged a heavy chair to the door, wedging it tight under the handle. It didn't help. At 2:17 a.m., the knocks came. 3 slow strikes that vibrated through the floorboards. The voices swelled in a horrible chorus, words rising and falling like a wave. We burned, we screamed. You walked away. Her chest heaved as she covered her ears and prayed, but it felt like the voices swallowed her prayer whole, smothering it with their rage. By the 5th night, she was a shell of herself. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were bloodshot, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She sat on the floor with her back to the door, clutching a kitchen knife in her lap. Her phone was gone, smashed and thrown out days ago. The clock ticked closer to 2:17. As the numbers flipped, the air seemed to thicken, and she felt her breath fog. 3 knocks, so loud this time that her teeth rattled. She shut her eyes, clutching the knife, whispering into the darkness, "What do you want from me?" For a moment there was only silence, then a hollow reply. Many voices speaking as one. "Take our place." She didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke, sunlight spilled across her floor in pale streaks, and her back ached from the hours spent pressed against the door. The knife still rested in her lap, cold and useless. Her body felt brittle, like glass that would shatter if touched. In the kitchen, she boiled water for coffee, though her hands trembled too hard to hold the cup steady. She had to do something, call someone, tell someone, but every thought ended the same way. Who would believe her? Who would listen without calling her broken? They already whispered about the crash, about her survival. Adding phantom knocks and voices of the dead would finish her. She spent the day wandering the apartment like a ghost. Every sound made her flinch. The hum of the fridge, a car door slamming in the street below. She counted the hours to nightfall with a mounting dread that clawed at her insides. When dusk settled, she found herself staring at the door again. It was just wood and metal, and yet it felt alive, like an eye watching her from the other side. That night, she didn't set up barriers. No chair, no knife. She sat cross-legged in the center of the room, phone smashed and gone, curtains drawn tight. The clock ticked like a heartbeat. 2:17 a.m. The first knock came so loud it rattled picture frames on the walls. She gasped, hands flying to her mouth as her eyes locked on the door. The second knock splintered the wood slightly. A thin crack snaked from the bottom corner upward, black as soot. The third knock was accompanied by a sound that chilled her blood. Fingers dragging slowly across the surface, nails scraping. Then the whispers began. "You don't belong here." The voices were closer this time, not muffled. She swore she could feel their breath on her neck, as dozens of hollow mouths murmured, "We burned, we screamed, we waited." Her stomach turned violently, and she doubled over, shaking. She whispered back, "Just 2 words. I'm sorry." Her voice was raw, breaking. The room went silent except for her ragged breathing. She pressed her palms to her ears, praying the quiet would hold. But from the crack in the door frame, a faint hiss snaked into the air. It was soft at first, then rising, a collective sigh from many throats. "Sorry won't bring us back." She scrambled backward on the floor until her spine slammed into the far wall. The air thickened, the temperature dropping so fast. Her breath hung in white puffs. Her eyes stung with tears as shadows pooled under the door like black water. Shapes shifted within them, hands, faces, open mouths screaming silently. She buried her face in her knees, rocking as she whispered over and over, "Please, please, please." But the voices only grew louder. When the sun rose, they were gone. The crack in the door remained, an ugly scar across the white paint. She didn't leave her apartment that day. Couldn't. Every time her hand touched the knob, her chest locked up, and her legs refused to move. She ate crackers from the pantry, sipped water from the tap, and sat staring at the door, as if it might spring open at any second. Her phone was gone, and she didn't dare use her laptop. She didn't want their voices finding another way in. Hours crawled by, in silence, broken only by her shallow breathing. She thought about the wreckage, about the man 2 rows ahead, who screamed his daughter's name as the plane split apart. She thought about the stewardess, who prayed aloud in Spanish. Their voices tangled with the whispers she now heard each night, and she wondered if she had really survived, or if she was just lingering. That night, she fought sleep, but lost. She woke to the sound of her name being whispered from all directions at once. "Open the door. Let us in. Open the door." She clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound wasn't in the room. It was in her head. The knocks came, harder than ever, shaking the pictures off her walls. 3 deliberate strikes, slow and final. She whimpered as the voices changed, some screaming, some weeping, all blending into one terrible demand: "Take our place." Her eyes snapped to the crack in the door, and she swore she saw a charred hand with blackened fingers curl around the edge. The nails scraped lightly as they slid down the wood. Her body felt paralyzed, her chest tight, as though unseen hands pressed against her ribs. She didn't remember blacking out, but the next thing she knew, she was sprawled on the floor, cold and stiff. Morning light leaked through the curtains, but it felt wrong somehow, too pale, too weak. Her limbs trembled as she pushed herself upright, every muscle aching. The door still bore the crack, but no hand remained. She stared at it for hours, waiting for the knocking to return in daylight. But daylight offered no relief. She swore she heard faint sobbing through the walls, far off and muffled, as if the voices couldn't quite reach her until night fell. When the clock struck noon, she flinched so hard her coffee spilled across her lap. She didn't clean it. She just sat in silence, staring at the hands of the clock as they circled ever closer to 2:17 a.m. The 6th night was worse than all the others combined. She hadn't planned to stay. She'd told herself all day that she would leave, find a hotel, sleep in her car, go anywhere but here. Yet when the sky deepened to grey and the first stars appeared, her body betrayed her. Her legs felt like lead, her chest too tight to draw a proper breath. She curled up on the couch with a blanket clutched to her chest, unable to move. She watched the clock tick closer to 2:17 a.m., heart hammering like a trapped bird. She didn't know if she expected the knocks to come louder or softer, faster or slower. She just knew they would come, and when they did, there would be nothing she could do to stop them. When the glowing digits flipped, her body stiffened. 3 booming knocks crashed against the door like fists of iron. The wood groaned under the force. A second later, the voices erupted. Not whispers now, but wails, shrieks, hundreds of throats screaming in unison. "You left us, you left us." She clamped her hands over her ears and sobbed, rocking back and forth. But the sound didn't come from outside anymore. It filled the room, the floor, the air inside her lungs. Then came the scratching, fingernails or claws dragging along the walls, starting at the door and crawling their way toward her. She pressed herself into the couch cushions, her eyes wide and unblinking. The sound moved past the door frame, across the ceiling, down the hallway, closer and closer, until it was right above her head. She could almost feel the weight of something crouched there waiting. Then came a voice, low, guttural, spoken directly into her ear though no one was there. "You don't belong here." Her breath hitched. She didn't dare turn her head, certain she would see a face inches from her own. Her eyes darted to the door. The crack had widened. Black liquid, thick as oil, oozed from the splintered wood and pooled on the floor. She whimpered as it crept toward her bare feet, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and decay. She bolted upright and ran for the bathroom, slamming the door and locking it behind her. She sat on the cold tile, knees hugged to her chest. Her phone was gone. There was no way to call for help. She stared at her reflection in the darkened mirror across from her. Her face looked pale and drawn, her eyes hollow, but then it shifted. A flicker in the glass. She wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind her stood rows of charred figures, bodies blackened and cracked, faces twisted in agony. Their mouths hung open in eternal screams as blackened hands reached for her shoulders. She screamed and threw the towel over the mirror, sobbing into her knees as the voices pressed closer. "Take our place, take our place, take our place." The bathroom light flickered. The knocking started again, not on the front door this time, but on the bathroom door. 3 slow knocks, each one harder than the last, sending tiny cracks, spider webbing through the paint. She held her breath. The voices were deafening now, filling every inch of her skull. She pressed her hands to her ears, rocking violently. "Take our place. Let us in. Take our place." A charred hand slammed against the bathroom window outside, black nails screeching down the glass. She screamed and buried her face in her lap. The pounding on the door grew more urgent. Then everything went silent. No knocks, no voices, not even her own sobs. She lifted her head slowly, chest heaving. The quiet pressed against her like a heavy, smothering blanket. For a moment she dared to hope it was over. Then a whisper came from beneath the door, so soft she barely heard it. "We're already inside." When morning came, she was still in the bathroom, her body stiff and aching from the cold floor. She didn't leave until sunlight reached across the tiles, warming her bare feet. She opened the door slowly, half expecting to see the living room full of blackened figures. But it was empty. The couch sat as she had left it, cushions dented where her body had been. The door was still cracked, but no black ooze remained. Only faint handprints smeared the walls, ash grey, long-fingered, and too high to belong to anyone living. She couldn't stay. She couldn't survive another night. She had to get out. But even as she packed a small bag, her hands shook violently. She felt watched. Every creak of the floorboards behind her made her spin around. Every shadow seemed too thick, too tall, too alive. By noon she stood in the hallway with her bag slung over her shoulder, staring at the elevator. But her feet refused to move. It felt wrong to leave. Like the moment she stepped outside, something would grab her from behind and drag her back in. Or worse, that she would open the door to the outside world and find only darkness, filled with whispering voices and charred hands reaching. She clutched her bag tighter, breathing fast. "You're being paranoid," she whispered to herself, but her words sounded thin and unconvincing. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, too long, too empty. She backed away, retreating into her apartment and locking the door. She sank to the floor, clutching her knees. Somewhere deep down, she knew the truth. Leaving wouldn't save her. Nowhere was safe. By the seventh night, time no longer felt real. Daylight was a brief, hollow reprieve. She existed in fragments, now meals left untouched. Water sipped mechanically, the clock checked every few minutes. Her world shrank to the size of her apartment, and even there she felt cornered. She didn't bother with the couch or her bed anymore. She sat in the center of the living room floor, legs crossed, arms wrapped around her knees. Her bloodshot eyes never left the door. The crack in the wood had grown wider, and from it seeped a faint, pulsing glow, like embers shifting in a dying fire. She'd stopped trying to explain it. This wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't her mind unraveling. It was real, and it wanted her. When the clock struck 2:17 a.m., she didn't flinch. She was already watching, as 3 deafening knocks exploded against the door. The impact shook the entire apartment. Dust drifted from the ceiling as frames toppled from the walls. Then came the voices, louder, clearer, no longer distant whispers, but a chorus of hundreds screaming in rage and agony. "We waited. We burned. Now you." The apartment lights flickered violently before dying, plunging her into darkness. Only the faint orange glow leaking from the crack in the door remained. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices didn't stop. They pressed against her skull from the inside. "You left us. You left us," over and over, until the words bled into a low, guttural growl. The temperature plummeted, her breath coming in white clouds. Her teeth chattered as shadows began, seeping from the crack like smoke. They coiled across the floor, twisting into fingers, arms, faces, each one burned beyond recognition, mouths open in silent screams. She stumbled backward until her spine hit the wall. The voices rose to a fever pitch. "Take our place. Take our place. Take our place." Blackened hands burst from the shadows, clawing toward her ankles. She scrambled to her feet, slipping on the cold wood floor. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she bolted for the bathroom, the only room with a lock. She slammed the door shut and pressed her weight against it, fumbling for the latch with shaking hands. The voices didn't stay outside. They were in the bathroom now, in the pipes, the walls, the air she breathed. The mirror across from her was no longer her reflection. Instead, charred faces pressed against the glass, their hollow eyes staring directly into hers. Mouths moved in soundless screams. She tore a towel from the rack and threw it over the mirror, heart hammering. The knocking started again, this time at the bathroom door. 3 impossibly loud strikes that sent cracks, spider webbing through the wood. She slid to the floor, clutching her head, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, please stop, I'm sorry." But the voices only answered with a mocking chorus. "Sorry won't bring us back." Her eyes darted to the vent in the ceiling as black smoke began pouring through it, coiling like a living thing. The smell of burning flesh filled her nose, acrid and choking. She coughed violently, tears streaming down her face. Shadows reached for her from beneath the door, clawed fingers scraping against the tiles. A faint, hollow laugh echoed through the room, too deep to be human. She knew she couldn't stay in here. The bathroom wasn't safe anymore. Nothing was. She forced herself to her feet, every muscle screaming in protest. She grasped the handle and yanked the door open. The living room was alive with shadows now, burned figures pacing, whispering, clawing at the walls. The front door was wide open, and beyond it was not her hallway, but a charred corridor, lined with bodies still smoldering in their seats. She backed away, shaking her head violently. No, no, this isn't real. But her bare foot brushed something warm, and she looked down to see blackened fingers gripping her ankle. She screamed as they yanked hard, sending her sprawling. Shadows surged around her, covering her skin in an icy grip. Dozens of voices spoke at once, too loud, too close. "It's your turn." She clawed at the floor, her nails breaking, as she tried to drag herself away. The front door yawned wider, and the corridor beyond pulsed like a living wound, heat radiating from its depths. She felt her body being pulled toward it, inch by inch, as the screaming voices grew deafening. She grabbed onto the edge of the couch, holding on with every ounce of strength left in her. Her nails dug into the fabric as tears blurred her vision. "I don't want to die," she sobbed. "Please let me go, please." But the voices didn't stop. If anything, they grew more furious. "We didn't want to die either." Hands clawed up her legs, burning her skin with their icy touch. She screamed as her grip slipped, the couch fabric tearing beneath her fingers. Her body slid across the floor, closer to the waiting inferno of the door. She could see faces in the flames now, rows of them passengers from the crash, staring back at her with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. The smell of smoke filled her lungs as her head tipped back, and she was dragged across the threshold. At 2:17 a.m., the apartment fell silent. The front door eased itself shut with a soft click. From outside in the hallway, there was no sound, no screaming, no knocking, no voices, only an eerie stillness, as though the space inside had never been occupied at all. But if anyone had dared press their ear to the door, they might have heard faint scratching from within. 3 slow knocks. She wasn't dead. At least, not entirely. She opened her eyes to darkness. Not the comforting kind of night that held the promise of dawn, but a thick, endless void that seemed to press against her skin. Her body felt weightless yet heavy, floating yet anchored. When she inhaled, the air tasted of smoke and iron, her lungs burning as though filled with ash. Slowly she realized she wasn't lying down. She was standing barefoot on something cold and damp. She reached out, fingers brushing against a wall that felt too smooth, too warm, almost like flesh. Her stomach churned violently. Somewhere in the distance, faint voices whispered her name. Not a question, not a plea, but a command. You shouldn't have survived. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound only grew louder, leaking through her skin and settling in her bones. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate strikes. But this time, they came from behind her eyes. Her vision pulsed with each knock, light flashing red and black in dizzying patterns. She stumbled forward, hands outstretched, trying to find a way out of the darkness. With every step, the voices grew closer, rising in a terrible chorus. "We're still burning. Why aren't you?" Her bare foot landed in something wet, and she froze. A warm, thick liquid oozed between her toes. She dared to look down. Though the darkness hid details, she could see faint ripples spreading from her foot. The smell hit her then, charred flesh and jet fuel. She gagged, clapping a hand over her mouth as bile burned her throat. She staggered backward and collided with the wall, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The wall shifted against her back. She spun around, horrified to see pale, blackened hands pressing out from the surface, their fingers scraping as though trying to claw free. Faces followed, rows of them, screaming silently, their mouths stretched unnaturally wide. She bolted forward, the sound of their nails following her like a swarm of insects. The darkness around her began to pulse in time with the knocks, each strike reverberating in her chest. Ahead, a faint light glimmered, a sickly reddish glow that grew brighter as she stumbled toward it. But as she neared, she realized it wasn't an exit. It was a door. Her door, the same one from her apartment, cracks still running down its surface like an old wound. She froze, her gut twisting into knots. From the other side came muffled voices, whispering her name again and again. "Open the door, open the door, open the door." She didn't want to. She turned to run, but her feet refused to move. The air thickened like syrup, pinning her in place. Her hands lifted against her will, fingers wrapping around the doorknob. It was hot, almost blistering, but she couldn't let go. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the knocking started again, 3 deafening booms from the other side. The voices changed, no longer whispering but shouting, "Let us in." She squeezed her eyes shut as the door creaked open on its own. Heat rushed out, searing her skin. A blinding light poured through the gap, and from it emerged charred hands that clawed at her arms, her throat, her face. She screamed as the hands pulled her forward, dragging her through the doorway. When her vision cleared, she was back in her apartment, or what was left of it. The walls were blackened, melted. The ceiling hung in tatters, and the floorboards were scorched and warped. But everything was wrong. The room stretched impossibly far, in all directions, like a funhouse mirror, warped into infinity. Faces stared out from the walls, dozens, hundreds, all screaming silently. She clutched her head, her nails digging into her scalp, as the voices grew deafening. "Why did you leave us?" She stumbled forward, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the floor. The apartment door was still there, at the far end of this endless space. She had to reach it. Maybe if she left, this would end. Maybe she could wake up for real this time. But with each step, the floor grew hotter. Smoke curled up around her ankles, and the screaming faces twisted in rage. The knocking started again, not from the door this time, but from every surface around her. 3 strikes, then 3 more. Then dozens pounding in unison, the sound like 100 fists hammering on wood and metal. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The knocks vibrated through her skull, rattling her teeth, making her vision blur. She fell to her knees, sobbing as the voices screamed, "Take our place, take our place, take our place." She crawled forward, the floor burning her palms, her eyes locked on the door. as her trembling hand reached for the knob. As her fingers brushed the metal, the voices fell silent. For a heartbeat, there was only her ragged breathing and the faint crackle of unseen flames. She turned her head slowly. Behind her, the shadows writhed and twisted, forming into human shapes, blackened bodies with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the way back. One figure stepped forward, its burnt skin hanging in ribbons, its empty sockets locked on hers. When it spoke, the voice wasn't one but many layered over each other, male and female, old and young. You survived, now you pay. Before she could react, the figure lunged forward, its hands closing around her throat. Her lungs burned as she clawed at the charred hands gripping her throat. Their blackened fingers felt impossibly strong, digging into her skin with a heat that seared like branding irons. She kicked and thrashed, nails raking across cracked, flaking flesh that crumbled to ash beneath her touch. But for every hand she broke free from, more appeared, pale and skeletal, reaching from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. "You don't belong here," the voices hissed in unison, a dreadful harmony that made her stomach lurch. Her vision began to tunnel, black creeping in from the edges as her body screamed for oxygen. In one last desperate surge, she tore free and stumbled backward, coughing violently. The figures didn't follow. They stood in silence, their hollow sockets watching her every move. But the knocking, oh God, the knocking, it didn't stop. It wasn't on the door anymore. It wasn't in the walls. It was inside her head. Each strike sent sharp, stabbing pain through her skull, as if invisible fists pounded the inside of her brain. She staggered toward the apartment door, clutching her head, teeth clenched against the pressure building behind her eyes. With every step, her surroundings twisted further. The walls melted and reformed, the blackened faces warping into familiar ones. The stewardess with her charred uniform and melted lips. The old man who clutched his wife's hand as flames swallowed them. The little boy in the aisle seat who never stopped crying. They all stared at her now, mouths moving silently before uniting in a single word. The word echoed like a gunshot in her mind, followed by 3 thunderous knocks that sent her to her knees. Blood trickled from her nose, warm and sticky against her upper lip. She screamed and pressed her palms to her ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was woven into her thoughts, an echo in the cavern of her skull. Why you? Why not us? The words overlapped, louder and louder until they were all she could hear. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she had to move. If she stayed here, the voices would consume her, hollow her out until she was just another screaming face in the walls. She dragged herself upright, legs shaking as she stumbled toward the door. Her fingers closed around the knob, and for an instant, the knocking ceased. Silence bloomed in her head like a toxic flower, thick and suffocating. Then, as she began to turn the knob, a single voice spoke, low and guttural. Not many voices, but one. "You'll never leave." The door burst open, blinding light flooding her vision. She shielded her face as a gust of searing air rushed past her, carrying with it the stench of jet fuel and burning flesh. When the light dimmed, she found herself not in her hallway but back on the plain. The aisles stretched endlessly in both directions, seats filled with blackened corpses twisted in impossible angles. Smoke curled from their bodies, and every single head turned to face her in perfect unison. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, her hands clutching at her temples, as the knocking inside her head grew violent. It wasn't 3 slow strikes anymore. It was a relentless barrage, hammering at the walls of her mind with cruel precision. Her teeth rattled from the vibrations, her vision splintering as dark shapes flitted at the edges of her sight. She crawled down the aisle, the floor slick beneath her palms with something warm and sticky. Ash rained from the overhead compartments, clinging to her hair and skin. As she moved, the voices began again, no longer asking why but chanting, "Take our place, take our place, take our place." Their words pounded in time with the hammering in her skull, until she thought her head might crack open from the pressure. She reached an emergency exit door, its handle glowing faintly in the dim light. She didn't know if it would save her or kill her, but she didn't care anymore. Anything was better than this. Her trembling hands grasped the handle, and she pulled with all her strength. The door groaned, heat rushing in through the widening crack. Behind her, hundreds of burnt hands gripped the seatbacks as the corpses began to rise, their movements jerky, unnatural, yet horribly purposeful. She yanked again, and the door flung open with a deafening roar. Instead of sky, there was nothing, just a black void swirling with shadows and whispers. Without hesitation, she hurled herself into it, the air snatching the scream from her throat as she fell. There was no wind, no impact, just endless falling. She didn't know if seconds passed or centuries. The knocking never stopped. It echoed in her ribcage now, as if her bones themselves were hollow and being used like drums. She clutched her head and screamed into the darkness, but her voice was swallowed instantly. Then abruptly she landed, not with a crash, but with a sickening softness, as though she'd fallen into flesh. She pushed herself upright, hands sinking into a warm, pulsing surface. The knocking shifted again. It was beneath her hands now, coming from inside whatever she was kneeling on. 3 slow booms that made the ground shudder. The whispers returned so close they tickled her ears. "You survived, now survive this." She realized then that she wasn't kneeling on the floor at all. She was kneeling on a massive, charred hand. Its fingers curled slowly, and before she could react, they closed around her body like a cage. She screamed and fought, but the hand squeezed tighter, forcing the air from her lungs. The knocking inside her head became deafening, blinding her with bursts of red light. Her body went limp as the voices spoke, one final time. "You're ours now." The hand lifted her into the air, and as she was pulled upward, the darkness around her began to peel away. She saw faint glimpses of her apartment, her bedroom, her front door. She saw herself lying in her bed, eyes open but unblinking. The knocking echoed faintly from the other side. 3 slow, patient strikes. She couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. Darkness clung to her vision like a second skin, thick and unyielding. But she could feel them, hundreds of unseen eyes watching from just beyond the void, their gaze sharp as knives. Each breath she took rasped in her throat, heavy with the scent of char and rot. Then came the sound, not knocking anymore. This was a pulsing, wet thud that kept perfect time with her heartbeat. It was inside her ribcage, vibrating through her bones. She clutched at her chest in panic as the sound grew louder, heavier, until it felt like her entire body was being struck from within. A voice slid between the beats, a whisper so intimate it seemed to slither directly into her skull. "You let us burn," she screamed, but the sound was swallowed before it left her lips. Another pulse. Another whisper. You should have stayed with us. The darkness flickered. Images began to stutter, in and out of her vision, like a broken reel of film. The plane's cabin stretched endlessly around her, bodies fused to their seats by melted belts, skin hanging in blackened ribbons. Then her apartment, but wrong, elongated walls crawling with ashen handprints, the floor slick with an oily black substance. Each time the scene shifted, the knocking returned, pounding louder and faster. It wasn't at the door or in the walls anymore. It was inside her skull. She felt each strike like a hammer to her mind, and with every blow, memories cracked and fell away. She couldn't remember her name, couldn't remember what her voice sounded like, couldn't remember why she was still fighting. Shadows poured from the corners of her fractured reality, whispering in unison, "Take our place. Take our place. Take our place." She stumbled forward through the shifting landscape, her bare feet splashing through the black liquid that seemed to coat every surface. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible hands clung to her ankles. She reached for the walls to steady herself, but every surface she touched pulsed, like living flesh, heat radiating from beneath. Faces pressed outward wherever her hands landed, charred, melted, their mouths gaping in silent agony. She jerked away, bile rising in her throat. "This isn't real," she whispered, but even as the words formed, a mocking chorus echoed them back in her head. "Isn't real, isn't real, isn't real." The voices didn't sound angry anymore. They sounded amused. Suddenly, she was back in her bedroom, or something pretending to be her bedroom. The air was thick and hot, smelling faintly of smoke and iron. The bed sat in the center, its sheets perfectly made. But the longer she stared, the more wrong it looked. The mattress shifted subtly, as though something massive and breathing lay beneath it. She stepped closer, despite every instinct screaming to run. As she neared, the sheets bulged upward, a blackened hand punching through the fabric. She stumbled backward with a choked scream as more hands erupted from the bed, dozens of them clawing at the air. From beneath the mattress came a single thunderous knock that reverberated through the floor and up her legs. The voices whispered, "You're already ours." She clamped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to shut it all out. But closing her eyes made it worse. The darkness behind her lids came alive with crawling shadows, their whispers pouring directly into her thoughts. "There's nowhere to run. There's no one left to save you. You shouldn't have survived." She felt their fingers pressing against her temples from the inside, prying into memories she didn't want to relive. The moment the plane tore open, the screams, the heat, the hand that brushed hers in the wreckage before going still. She sobbed as the knocking inside her head grew frantic, faster now, as though whatever was in there was desperate to get out. The floor beneath her cracked with a deafening roar, and she fell. She didn't land this time. She just kept falling, tumbling through endless black. The knocking had no rhythm now, pounding chaotically from every direction. The voices screamed in unison, no longer forming words, but a wall of sound so loud it made her teeth vibrate. She felt something clawing at her chest from the inside. The darkness didn't just surround her now, it seeped into her, filling every vein, every hollow space inside her bones. She felt bloated with it, her skin stretched tight as though she might burst. The hands pulling her downward multiplied, their grip burning and freezing at once. She tried to scream, but her jaw refused to open. Something was in her mouth, writhing like a living shadow. When she reached up, her fingers brushed her lips, only to find them sewn shut, not with thread, but with hundreds of tiny blackened hands, gripping her teeth closed from the inside. The voices whispered from her throat, using her own lungs to speak. "You carried us out of the fire. Now we carry you back." The knocking pounded through her body, so deep and violent it made her ribs ache. Each beat grew heavier, slower, until it was no longer separate from her pulse. Suddenly, the darkness peeled away. She was back in her apartment, or what was left of it. The walls were sagging, melted like candle wax. The floorboards were soft beneath her feet, pulsing faintly as though they were alive. Faces stared out from every surface, charred, blackened and weeping. She staggered toward the window, but when she pulled the curtains aside, there was nothing but an endless void, thick with ash that swirled in unnatural currents. She turned back and froze. The door, the front door, stood ajar. From beyond it came a faint, flickering light and the sound of distant screaming. She didn't want to move, but her legs carried her forward, step by reluctant step, as if she were a puppet dangling from unseen strings. The door creaked wider with every footfall, revealing more of the corridor beyond. It wasn't her hallway, it was the plains aisle, blackened and buckled, walls dripping with molten metal. Smoke curled lazily from the ceiling as rows of scorched seats stretched on forever. Every seat was full. Burnt bodies sat rigidly upright, their hollow eyes locked on her. The air grew thick, choking her lungs with the acrid stench of charred flesh. She stumbled forward, unable to stop herself. As she passed each row, the passengers whispered in unison, "Take our place, take our place, take our place." Their voices rose with each step, until the sound was deafening, pounding against her skull like a physical force. She reached the cockpit door. Its surface bulged unnaturally, like something inside was pressing outward. From beyond came 3 slow knocks, so deep and resonant they rattled her teeth. Her hand rose without her consent, fingers brushing the handle. She fought to stop, muscles straining, but her body betrayed her. "This is where you belong." The voices hissed from all around. The handle turned beneath her touch, and the door swung inward. Heat and light flooded out, blinding her. For a moment, she saw nothing but flames, swirling and roaring like a living beast. Then, shapes began to emerge within the inferno, figures walking toward her, their charred skin crackling, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "You shouldn't have survived," they said, in perfect unison. "So we'll make sure you didn't." The nearest figure reached for her, its blackened hand closing around her wrist. Pain flared instantly, searing her flesh as the skin bubbled and cracked beneath its touch. She screamed, or tried to, but no sound came. The voices continued, rising to a fever pitch. "You left us to burn. You crawled from the wreckage. You took what wasn't yours." More hands gripped her arms, her legs, her throat. The heat became unbearable, blistering her skin. She thrashed wildly, but the shadows held her fast. "Take our place, take our place, take our place, take our place." They began to pull her forward, into the flames. She felt her skin splitting, her body breaking apart piece by piece as the fire consumed her. And then, silence. She opened her eyes to find herself lying on her apartment floor. The morning sun streamed weakly through the curtains. The walls were clean, white, unburnt. The door was whole, no cracks, no black ooze, no handprints. She blinked, tears streaming down her face, as she struggled to sit up. Was it over? Was it all a nightmare? Her body ached, but there were no burns, no scars. She staggered to her feet and stumbled toward the kitchen. Everything looked normal, too normal. The clock on the wall ticked softly, 2:16 a.m. She froze. 3 slow knocks shook the front door. The morning felt like a lie. The sunlight seeping through her curtains was too thick, too golden, like syrup spilling slowly over the world outside. She sat rigid on the edge of her bed, her bare feet flat against the cold floorboards, staring blankly at her hands. They trembled, not with the familiar quiver of anxiety or exhaustion, but with something deeper. It was a trembling that seemed to begin in her bones, in the marrow itself, as though something alive and restless had nested there during the night. She tried rubbing her palms together, pressing them tightly enough to blanch her knuckles, but the sensation didn't stop. She could still feel it, the faint rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate, rising from somewhere behind her ribs. Knock, knock. A chill crawled up her spine, and she pressed her hand to her chest as if to silence it. But the sound persisted, muted yet steady. A pause, then again. Knock, knock. Her breath hitched, and she whispered to herself, "It's over, it's over, it's over." But she didn't believe it. Not when the knocking kept answering her from inside her own body, a mocking metronome to her denial. She forced herself to stand, legs shaky and weak, and stumbled toward the bathroom. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if invisible hands gripped her ankles, tugging gently, testing her resistance. The apartment was silent, too silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the suffocating stillness of something waiting, unseen, in the dark. By the time she reached the bathroom, the air felt thick and humid, sticking to her skin in clammy patches. She turned the faucet and splashed water on her face, hoping the shock of cold would banish the creeping dread. But as she looked up, her reflection didn't seem quite right. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they looked hollow, the whites threaded with thin red lines, like cracks in porcelain. She leaned closer, gripping the sink as her heart pounded. The knocking shifted slightly, now vibrating faintly in her throat, a deep, internal sound that rattled her teeth in their sockets. She gagged, slamming her palm against her neck in reflex, but there was nothing to dislodge. The sound was part of her now. Knock, knock, knock. She stumbled backward, gripping her throat as bile threatened to rise. Her reflection tilted its head slightly, a fraction too slow to be natural. Then it smiled, not her usual uncertain human smile, but a slow, deliberate curl of lips that didn't feel like her own. She gasped, and her reflection whispered, "We're almost out." She screamed and swung her fist at the glass. The mirror shattered, and jagged shards rained down, clattering in the sink and across the tiled floor. She staggered back, clutching her bleeding hand, her pulse hammering in her ears. But even over the rush of blood, she could still hear it. Knock, knock. She fled the bathroom, heart racing, breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The apartment seemed smaller now, the walls closer than she remembered, almost breathing in time with her ragged exhales. She collapsed onto the couch and curled into herself, nails digging crescent moons into her palms as she rocked back and forth. The knocking didn't stop. It was everywhere now, her chest, her skull, her belly. Every inch of her seemed to vibrate faintly, as if her veins were hollow tubes, carrying not blood, but the echo of fists pounding from within. She clenched her teeth until her jaw ached. But the sound didn't relent. If anything, it grew clearer, sharper. She could almost make out syllables forming within the rhythm. Should have. Knock, knock, left us, knock, knock, come back. Her stomach lurched violently. She bolted upright and ran to the kitchen sink, just in time to retch, black bile splattering the steel basin. She spat and wiped her mouth with a trembling hand. Her skin itched horribly now, a crawling sensation beneath the surface, like ants tunneling through her flesh. She scratched at her arms until they were raw and streaked with blood, but the itching only grew worse, accompanied by faint, sickening ripples moving under her skin, like something alive trying to find a way out. The sun had long since slipped below the horizon by the time she realized she was afraid to blink. Every time her eyelids fell, she saw them, the faces, rows of blackened, melted visages staring out from the darkness, their mouths moving silently, eyes hollow and accusing. "Why you?" they seemed to say. "Why not us?" She kept her eyes wide until they burned, her nails digging deeper into her arms. Her body vibrated with each knock, no longer just a sound but a physical force that seemed to pulse in her muscles. She staggered to her feet, intent on leaving the apartment, but when her fingers wrapped around the doorknob, a familiar voice whispered from inside her skull, "There's nowhere else to go." She jerked her hand away, as though burned, and stumbled back, clutching her head. The knocking inside her skull sped up, each strike sharp and jarring like nails on glass. She felt her legs give out, and she crumpled to the floor, gasping. Her reflection's words echoed faintly in her mind. "We're almost out." She tried to crawl, her nails scratching against the floorboards, but even the wood felt different, soft, almost pliant, like flesh stretched thin over bone. Beneath her fingers, she felt vibrations that matched the knocking in her body. She gagged, tears blurring her vision as she scrambled back into a corner. Her body was betraying her now, muscles twitching without her consent, her jaw flexing on its own. A deep, guttural sound bubbled up from her throat. Not a scream, not a sob, but something inhuman, low and wet. She clamped both hands over her mouth, shaking violently as she felt her lips moving against her palms. The voice that escaped wasn't hers. "You're the door." Her stomach lurched again as she felt movement beneath her ribs. Something, no, many somethings, pressing outward, testing her flesh, searching for seams. She sobbed, curling tighter into herself as her skin stretched and rippled. The knocking slowed slightly, returning to its deliberate, patient rhythm. "Knock, knock," the voices whispered from inside her. "Lens, now, soft and coiled with hunger. You survived the fire, but not us." She stayed like that for hours, or was it minutes, rocking on the cold floor as her body shivered with each internal strike. Her nails were broken and bloody, her arms covered in raw red streaks where she'd clawed at the itching. She was losing herself. The edges of her thoughts frayed and curled like burning paper, and in the charred gaps, the voices settled. They spoke to her in lullabies and screams, in whispers layered so thick she couldn't tell if they were angry or joyous. "Almost through," they chanted, "almost free." Her breath hitched as she felt something shift in her jaw, a subtle stretching, a faint cracking, as though the hinge of her mouth was loosening. She clamped her hands over it again, tears streaming down her face. She could feel fingers pressing up behind her teeth, testing them like hinges. She shook her head violently,
whispering to no one. No, 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 no. But the knocking continued, unbothered, patient as ever. The last thing she remembered before her body gave out completely was the sound of scratching, faint at first, then growing louder. It wasn't coming from the walls or the door. It came from inside her chest, tiny, persistent claws dragging down the inside of her ribs. As her vision went black, she heard her own voice whisper one final terrible sentence: "We're ready to come out."
She woke to the sound of her own breathing, but it wasn't hers. It came in slow, measured pulls, each inhale long and deliberate, each exhale drawn out like a sigh of satisfaction. Her chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, though her mind screamed at her limbs to move, to fight, to run. She couldn't. Her body was no longer hers. Panic flared hot in her gut as her eyes, her own traitorous eyes, shifted to the left, focusing on the cracked mirror across the room. In its reflection, she saw her lips curling into a smile. She didn't feel. It was too wide, too calm, the smile of something with all the time in the world. Inside her skull, the knocking began again. Knock, knock, but this time it wasn't distant. It pulsed directly behind her eyes, a heavy, deliberate pounding that made her temples throb. She wanted to scream, but instead, her mouth opened slowly, and a voice that wasn't hers rasped out. Not much longer. The air in the apartment felt wrong, thicker somehow, heavy with the faint smell of ash and iron. She could sense movement in the corners of the room, shadows that seemed to writhe and curl like smoke, never quite solid, never fully there. Her body stood without her consent, bare feet soundless against the floorboards, as she moved toward the window. The curtains were already drawn back, and beyond the glass was not the familiar cityscape. Instead, there stretched an endless black plain, scattered with smoldering wreckage. Pieces of twisted metal jutted from the ground, like the ribs of some colossal, long-dead beast. And there were faces, dozens, hundreds half buried in the ash, their mouths moving in silent screams. She pressed her palm to the glass, and it felt warm, almost pulsing beneath her touch. Her reflection stared back at her with hollow, blackened eyes. Knock, knock, knock. "You're almost ready," it whispered, lips moving out of sync with her own. She tried to fight, clawing at the edges of her mind, desperate to take back even a shred of control. For a brief, precious moment, her fingers twitched, her own movement, not theirs. She latched onto it, pouring every ounce of her will into pulling her hand away from the glass. Her fingers jerked back, trembling violently, and she gasped, her own breath at last. But then came a sound, wet, slick, like flesh tearing. A sudden spike of pain shot through her forearm. She looked down in horror as a dark, jagged line split her skin from wrist to elbow, as if something inside was dragging its claws along the underside of her flesh. She screamed, falling to her knees as thick, black liquid oozed from the wound. The knocking returned, heavier now, pounding in her chest and throat, until she choked. Her lips moved against her will, and that voice, low, guttural, alien, spoke through her gritted teeth. Almost free, the apartment began to distort around her, walls melting like wax, the ceiling sagging low, as if about to collapse. Faces pressed outward from the sagging drywall, charred and weeping, their mouths opening and closing in a soundless chorus. The air shimmered with heat. She crawled backward, dragging herself across the floor, but every movement felt sluggish, like fighting through molasses. The knocking inside her skull grew frantic, reverberating through her teeth until they ached. She felt her tongue moving again, shaping words she didn't choose. "You can't stop us. You are the door." Her body convulsed violently, and her hands shot to her mouth as a sharp pain split her jaw. It was stretching, widening, cracking at the hinges. She felt something cold and brittle press upward from her throat, and for one terrible moment, she thought she might see fingers pushing out between her teeth. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, mixing with sweat and blood. She clawed at her own throat, desperate to rip whatever was inside her out. But her fingernails found no purchase, just smooth, unbroken skin vibrating with each internal strike. Knock, 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 she sobbed, curling into a ball as the voices rose louder in her head, overlapping into a cacophony of screams and laughter. "You survived their fire. Now carry ours." The walls seemed to pulse with the words, each syllable a blow that rattled the floorboards. She could feel them, hundreds of charred hands sliding just beneath her skin, exploring, pressing, searching for weaknesses. The air thickened further, until it felt like she was breathing in smoke. She coughed violently, black flecks splattering the floor, and realized with horror that the taste in her mouth was ash. She didn't know how long she lay there, rocking back and forth, whispering fragmented prayers. Minutes, hours. The knocking slowed again, falling back into its deliberate, patient rhythm. Knock, knock. With each pause she felt her resolve crumble further, like a wall battered by endless waves. She was so tired, so impossibly tired. "Let us finish," the voices coaxed gently, their tone almost tender now. "We'll make it quick. You don't need to fight anymore." For a fleeting, shameful second, she wanted to say yes, anything to make the pounding stop, to silence the endless whispers and scratching and heat. But then she saw it, the faintest ripple beneath the skin of her stomach, fingers pressing outward, searching for a seam. She clenched her jaw and screamed, her own voice raw and broken this time. "No, you're not taking me." The air felt heavier than her own skin. Each breath she drew rattled in her lungs, like broken glass, sharp and shallow. She tried to sit up, but her limbs quivered violently, her muscles clenching and releasing without her command. It wasn't just her body anymore. It was them. They were testing her, stretching her from the inside like a glove they were trying to fill. Knock, knock, knock. The sound vibrated deeper now, no longer behind her ribs but rooted in her spine, pounding upward toward her skull. Her teeth clattered with each impact, and a metallic taste filled her mouth. She reached up to steady her head, but her fingers jerked violently and clawed at her own scalp. Her nails scraped deep enough to draw blood before she could stop. A voice, hers but wrong, slid from her lips, low and gurgling. "You can't hold us much longer." The sound didn't echo in the room. It echoed inside her chest cavity. The walls of the apartment rippled in her peripheral vision, swelling like lungs filled too far. Shadows oozed from the corners, thick and viscous, sliding across the floorboards in snaking tendrils. The air reeked of charred meat and burnt plastic, and the temperature climbed so fast beads of sweat pooled at her hairline, running in streaks down her cheeks. She tried to crawl backward, her body jerking like a marionette fighting its strings. But the knocking only grew louder, hammering now in a steady, violent rhythm that reverberated through every bone. Knock, knock, knock. Then a pause so sudden it made her flinch. A single voice whispered from her stomach, vibrating against her organs, "We're coming through." Her belly bulged outward, skin stretching tight as many somethings pressed outward from beneath. She clutched at her abdomen, sobbing as her flesh rippled under her own hands. Her scream was swallowed by the apartment. It didn't sound like a scream anymore. It came out layered, too many voices twisting around hers, some high and shrill, others deep and guttural. They laughed in unison. "You survived them, but you won't survive us." Her jaw cracked audibly, the hinge loosening with a sickening pop. She clamped her hands over her mouth, feeling her lips twitch and curl as they formed words she didn't want. "Open, open, open." Her legs stiffened, slamming her knees into the floor with bruising force. She fought for control, shoving her will against the invading pressure, but it was like pushing against a tidal wave. Her hands jerked away from her face, clawing at the floorboards. She could feel her fingernails lifting, splitting from the quick as she raked them down the wood in desperate resistance. But even as she fought, her chest heaved unnaturally, ribs expanding wider than they should. The skin across her sternum bulged and throbbed. Almost, the ceiling groaned above her, the sound impossibly loud, and she swore she saw hands pressing down from the other side, dozens of them blackened and clawing at invisible seams. The knocking resumed, thunderous now, shaking dust loose from the walls. Knock, knock, knock. Her head snapped back violently as her spine arched, tendons in her neck standing out in sharp relief. Her lips peeled back in a rictus grin. She could feel them, hundreds of fingers now, crawling beneath her skin, testing the barrier between their world and hers. She sobbed between gasps. "Please, don't, please." But the voices didn't answer this time. They didn't need to. The knocking filled every thought, every breath, until there was nothing left but its relentless rhythm. Suddenly, her body froze. The apartment fell silent, except for her wheezing breaths. She lay motionless on the floor, staring up at the ceiling with glassy eyes. Then came a sound, a faint cracking, like ice shifting underfoot. She looked down in time to see her abdomen split slightly along a jagged, blackened seam. No blood spilled, only smoke, thick and acrid. Tiny fingers pressed outward from the tear, wriggling against the edges of the wound. Her scream came out broken, strangled, but her arms wouldn't obey her commands to push them back in. "Let us out," the voices hissed in unison, rising from her belly like steam escaping a kettle. The pressure inside her chest grew unbearable, every heartbeat a hammer blow. Her vision dimmed around the edges as her body convulsed. The knocking accelerated wildly, erratic now, pounding so hard her ears rang with each strike. Knock, 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 knock. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was worse. She lay limp on the floor, body slick with sweat and streaked with soot-like ash. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the ceiling, terrified to move. Her belly no longer bulged. Her ribs no longer ached. For one fragile moment she dared to hope they had gone. But then, from deep inside her chest, came a single slow knock, followed by a whisper so soft, it felt like it was coiled around her spine. "The door is open." She didn't move for what felt like hours, her body heavy and foreign, every muscle taut with a tension she couldn't release. The single knock still echoed faintly in her chest, reverberating like the aftershock of a distant quake. "The door is open," the voice had whispered, and though her rational mind screamed for her to deny it, some deeper, primal part of her already knew it was true. She was no longer just herself. She was hollowed out, a passage lined with raw nerves and fragile bones. She tried to lift her hand, but it was sluggish, resisting her efforts like it belonged to someone else. Her fingers flexed jerkily, twitching with faint, unnatural movements she didn't command. Panic surged hot in her throat. She could feel them, the faint brush of phantom hands sliding along the insides of her limbs, testing joints and tendons, growing bolder with every heartbeat. They weren't waiting anymore. They were exploring, occupying, claiming. The air around her shimmered, distorting as though heat radiated from her skin. The apartment twisted at the edges of her vision. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, one moment, and suffocatingly low. The next, the walls pulsing gently like living flesh. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, resonating deep in her teeth. She tried to crawl, forcing her arms and legs to obey, but her body was uncooperative, jerking with spastic, puppet-like motions. Knock, knock. This time, it wasn't just inside her. It came from the walls too, and from beneath the floor, a cascading chorus of pounding fists. Her eyes darted to the front door. It bulged inward with each knock, the wood splintering slightly around the edges. Black liquid seeped from the cracks, pooling on the floor like oil. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as her fingernails scraped the floor, leaving bloody crescents in the wood. She wasn't sure if she was trying to pull herself away or hold herself together. Suddenly, her head jerked back of its own accord. Her jaw unhinged slightly, stretching wider than it should, tendons straining audibly in her neck. She felt the pressure building again, swelling in her chest and throat, like a living thing forcing its way up. Her lips began to twitch, curling against her will into a smile that felt alien and grotesque. "We're here now," a chorus of voices whispered from her mouth. Their tones overlapped, some high and lilting, others guttural and wet, speaking in a rhythm that matched the pounding beneath her skin. She clamped her hands over her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks as her shoulders shook violently. But it didn't stop. Her lips continued to move beneath her palms, wet whispers slipping out between her fingers. "We're stepping through." Her belly rippled visibly, the skin stretching as though pressed from the inside. Fingers, charred, blackened too many, prodded outward, their tips leaving faint smudges on her skin before withdrawing again. Her entire torso shivered with their movements, and she let out a muffled sob, shaking her head violently. The room's temperature plummeted, her breath fogging the air in shallow clouds. Shadows pooled thicker around her, writhing with a life of their own. She felt her spine arch sharply as a new pain erupted behind her shoulder blades, blunt pressure, then sharp tearing as though unseen claws dragged down her back from within. She screamed, the sound cracking her throat raw, and heard an echo, not from the walls but from inside her own ribcage. A wet, sucking noise filled the room, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic scratching from her abdomen. She realized with a jolt of horror what it was, fingernails dragging against bone from the inside. The voices rose again, their layered tones vibrating in her skull, until it felt like her brain might split apart. "We're almost through. Just one more push." Her body convulsed violently, her arms flinging outward as if pulled by invisible strings. She felt her ribcage creak alarmingly, her sternum flexing outward with each successive knock. The pressure was unbearable now, building toward an inevitable catastrophic release. Her mouth snapped open, jaw hanging slack, as smoke poured out in heavy, acrid waves. It stung her eyes, thick and oily, coiling through the air to form vague humanoid shapes.
that wavered and shivered like candle flames in a breeze. The shadows gathered near the walls, pressing against them until faint handprints bloomed across the paint, too large and misshapen to be human. The air crackled with energy, tiny arcs of static dancing across her skin. She felt her consciousness slipping, receding like a tide pulled back by some unseen force. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It was a vessel, a threshold, a door swinging wide. Then silence. The knocking ceased all at once, leaving her ears ringing with the sudden absence of sound. Her limbs went limp, her body crumpling to the floor like a discarded doll. The apartment was still again, eerily so. She lay there gasping, staring at the ceiling with blurred vision as sweat and tears mingled on her cheeks. Slowly her senses returned, each breath tentative as though testing the air for danger. The walls were back to normal, the shadows gone. The front door stood whole and unbroken, no sign of cracks or seeping black ooze. She blinked rapidly, struggling to make sense of the calm. Had she won? Was it over? Her trembling fingers brushed against her stomach, feeling only smooth, unbroken skin. Relief trickled weakly through her like sunlight through storm clouds. She almost believed she was safe. Almost. Then came the sound, soft, slow, from behind her. Footsteps.
The footsteps were impossibly soft, like bare skin brushing against wood, yet each step seemed to echo through her skull in perfect clarity. Her breath caught in her throat, and she dared not move. A primal instinct told her to stay still, to become smaller than the space she occupied, to hope that whatever walked behind her might pass without noticing. But it wasn't passing. It was circling, slowly, deliberately. Her ears strained to follow the sound as it moved across the room, each step dragging slightly, as though the thing dragging them wasn't used to having legs. The air around her thickened again, carrying the faint stench of burnt hair and spoiled meat. She swallowed hard, biting back a sob. Then a voice, not quite human, unfurled softly near her ear. "You opened the door for us. You are still open." She jerked violently, slamming a hand over her mouth to silence her gasp. But the voice continued, low and coaxing, sliding beneath her skin like smoke. "Come and see. Come walk with us." She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head furiously. No, no, but the sound of footsteps resumed, padding gently toward the hallway. She heard a faint scratching along the walls as they passed, fingers testing their new freedom, nails dragging lazily across paint. With every step, the apartment grew colder, the air dense with something unseen yet suffocatingly present. She felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding so violently, she thought her ribs might crack. Then, silence, a silence so deep it seemed to hum. She opened her eyes a fraction, just enough to see the floorboards in front of her. There, smeared across the wood, were faint blackened footprints, each one warped, toes too long, arches twisted unnaturally. They led toward the hall, toward the door. Her stomach churned violently, bile rising in her throat. She pressed her forehead to the floor and whispered, "Please, don't make me." But the answer came instantly, sweet and terrible, "You will." Somehow, her body began to move, not of her own will, not even as it had before, with jerky puppet-like ticks. This was different, smooth, graceful, fluid. Her legs folded beneath her, and she rose to stand, hands limp at her sides. Her head turned of its own accord, and she saw them. Shadows, tall and thin, vaguely human but wrong in their proportions. They drifted down the hall in single file, their outlines blurring at the edges like smoke struggling to hold shape. Their heads tilted unnaturally, long arms trailing fingers that scraped faint grooves into the walls as they moved. Though they had no faces, she felt their gaze all the same, heavy and invasive, like invisible fingers prying into her thoughts. "You survived alone," they whispered as one, their voices overlapping in a chorus of accusation and delight. "But you were never meant to." She wanted to resist, to scream, to collapse back onto the floor and curl into nothingness, but her body obeyed their call. Step by step, she followed. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, each footfall sounding muted, distant, as though she were already halfway between worlds. The light around her dimmed to a heavy grey, the walls pulsing faintly like living tissue. She reached out instinctively and recoiled in horror as her fingers sank slightly into the surface, the texture warm and slick like flesh. The shadows ahead didn't falter. They drifted forward with the same unnatural grace, whispering fragments of words that wormed into her mind. "See where we burned, see where we scream, see why we knock." Her feet moved faster. She tried to stop them, muscles trembling with effort, but her legs were no longer hers. The front door loomed ahead, tall and warped now, its surface marred with handprints and deep gouges where fists had pounded relentlessly night after night. The knob turned on its own, and the door creaked open, revealing not the apartment hallway but a void, black, endless, rippling faintly, like water disturbed by unseen currents. The shadows stepped through one by one, their voices echoing from the other side. "Come and see." A blast of heat struck her face, and with it came a sound she hadn't heard since the crash. Screams, hundreds of them, a chorus of agony rising from the depths of the void, layered with the roar of flames and the metallic groan of tearing steel. Her legs carried her forward despite her sobs, her fingernails gouging deep crescents into her palms. As her foot crossed the threshold, the heat intensified, searing her skin and filling her nostrils with the acrid stench of burning flesh. "This is where you left us," they whispered. "This is where you began." The world beyond the door was a wasteland of twisted wreckage and ash. Fragments of the plane lay scattered across an endless black plain, seats ripped from their bolts, luggage burst open, and spilling charred belongings, bodies half buried in soot with mouths still frozen in silent screams. The sky was a churning vortex of grey and red, clouds shot through with veins of lightning. She stumbled forward, finally regaining control of her legs but too stunned to flee. The shadows drifted around her in a wide circle, their voices rising in eerie harmony. "You crawled free, alone, but alone is not allowed." Her hands flew to her ears as she fell to her knees, sobbing, rocking violently. "I didn't mean to. I didn't." But they ignored her pleas. One of the shadows bent low, its featureless face inches from hers. She felt its weight in her skull, a pressure that made her teeth ache. Then opened wider. "Let us finish." Her jaw began to ache again, stretching, straining against tendons that screamed in protest. She could feel them pressing at the edges of her thoughts, seeping into every crevice of her mind like smoke, filling a locked room. Her voice, barely her own anymore, whispered, broken, "Please, don't." But in her heart, she already knew the truth. They weren't asking. The air thickened like syrup. As she knelt in the ash, her knees sinking slightly into the scorched ground, the shadows circled her in silence. Now, their forms wavering as though barely held together, a dull roar filled her ears. the kind that came right before a tidal wave crashed. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound vibrated inside her skull, bypassing flesh and bone. Then came the whisper, soft at first, then rising like 1,000 overlapping voices. We were them, we are them, and we are hungry. She shook her head violently, whispering, "No," over and over, but her voice sounded thin, meaningless against their chorus. One of the shadows detached from the circle and drifted closer. It bent low, its featureless head tilting as if examining her. Then, in a voice that felt like heat crawling up her spine, it spoke, "You were meant to burn too." Suddenly her vision shifted. The world flickered like a dying film reel, and she saw herself, not here, not now, but crumpled in the wreckage of the plane. Flames licked at twisted metal. Screams cut through the air. Blackened hands reached for her from beneath fallen seats, clutching at her ankles as she scrambled free. She remembered this, the moment she'd clawed her way out of the fuselage, skin blistering from heat, lungs filling with smoke. But this time, it was different. This time, as she pulled herself clear, she looked back and saw them, the passengers, all of them, staring at her with wide, hollow eyes as the fire consumed them. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, whispering a single word, "Stay," but she hadn't stayed. She had run. And as she ran, she heard the knocking for the first time, soft at first, then harder, pounding in her ears until it became the only sound. The vision shattered, leaving her gasping in the ash. Her hands trembled as she stared down at them. They weren't hers anymore. Her fingers had blackened at the tips, nails curling like scorched paper. She rubbed at them furiously, trying to scrape away the char, but the more she rubbed, the deeper the blackness spread. Her skin cracked, and a faint glow pulsed beneath the surface, red like embers. The shadows swirled faster now, whispering to her from all sides. "You carried us out. You are the ember in the ash." She staggered to her feet, swaying as heat rolled off her body in waves. I didn't mean to," she cried, clutching her stomach as if she could hold the heat inside. But the shadows only laughed, dry, hollow laughter, like wind scraping through bones. One stepped closer and extended a long, spindly finger toward her chest. It pressed lightly against her sternum, and her skin burned at the contact. She felt something shift behind her ribs, a flutter of movement, like wings unfurling. The voice came again, softer now, almost tender. "You're still open. Stay open. Let us finish." She shook her head, stumbling backward, but her feet dragged through the ash, as though the ground clung to her. The heat inside her chest flared, and she felt the knock again, not from outside, not from her walls or her door, but deep within her lungs. Knock, knock. Her breath hitched as she coughed, black smoke curling from her lips. Her voice, no longer entirely hers, whispered hoarsely, "What are you?" The shadows stilled. Slowly, they parted, forming a wide circle around her. Beyond them, the ash began to churn. Shapes rose from the ground, charred bodies dragging themselves upright, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were familiar, too familiar. These were the passengers, the people she had sat with only hours before the crash, the laughing couple in 14B, the mother clutching her baby in row 22, the elderly man reading quietly by the window. All of them stared at her with hollow sockets where eyes should be. Their mouths moved, whispering in unison, "You left us. You carried us. Now let us carry you." She stumbled back, her stomach twisting violently. The heat surged higher,
and she doubled over as a sharp pain split her abdomen. She felt movement there again, fingers dragging against her insides, testing her like a lock about to give way. She fell to her knees, sobbing as her body convulsed. The passengers drew closer, their burned hands reaching for her. She wanted to scream, but when her mouth opened, a voice not her own spoke. "The door is open. Step through." Her body began to rise, lifted by unseen hands, feet dangling inches above the ashen ground. The shadows swirled tightly around her, their voices rising into a deafening chant. "Stay open, stay open, stay open, stay open."
Her body hovered inches above the ashen plain, suspended like a puppet caught between a master's hands. Heat rippled off her skin in visible waves, distorting the air around her. The chant thundered in her skull. "Stay open, stay open, stay open." She could feel them now, not just in her belly or chest, but sliding up into her throat, coiling behind her eyes. Something cold and slick brushed the roof of her mouth from the inside. She gagged violently, thrashing against the invisible grip holding her aloft, but her limbs refused to obey. Below her, the burned passengers stretched their arms skyward, their blackened fingers twitching, as if tasting the heat radiating from her. One by one they whispered in a chorus of longing. "Through her, through her, through her." Their words vibrated in the air like the hum of a swarm. She felt her jaw ache again, her lips peeling back in a grotesque grin that wasn't hers. The shadows circled tighter, pressing inward until their forms blurred together, a single writhing mass of darkness. From the center of that mass, a pair of hands emerged, long, skeletal, their skin charred and cracked like scorched earth. They reached for her face with slow, deliberate intent. "We need more space," the voices hissed as one, each syllable scraping across her nerves like a serrated blade. The hands cupped her cheeks gently, almost tenderly before applying pressure. Pain exploded behind her eyes as her skull began to stretch unnaturally, joints straining, as though her head was being pried open, like a door on rusted hinges. She screamed, or tried to. Only a dry rasp came out, choked off by the thing pressing up in her throat. "Let us finish. Don't close. Don't close." Her fingers twitched at her sides, and for the briefest moment she felt her own will flare, a spark in a hurricane. She tried to force her arms upward, to claw at the hands gripping her face, but her body rebelled. Her left hand jerked violently, slamming against her own ribs, as though trying to keep something from pushing out. Beneath her skin, her ribs flexed outward unnaturally, sharp points straining against her flesh like trapped blades. Black liquid bubbled from her nostrils, dripping down her chin in thick, tarry ropes. The burned passengers below grew restless, shifting from foot to foot, their mouths stretching impossibly wide as they chanted louder, "Step through, step through, step through." The temperature plummeted suddenly, each breath a foggy plume, as frost began to creep across her skin in delicate web-like patterns. A sudden snap cracked through the air as one of her ribs gave way with a sharp, wet sound. Agony rippled through her chest, and for a moment the pressure inside surged forward. She felt them pressing at her sternum from within, dozens of fingers' knuckles, even whole palms flattening against her ribcage, searching for a seam to split her wide. The voices roared in triumph. Almost there, almost free. But then she felt something else, a faint tug deep in her belly, cold and steady like a hook being drawn backward. It was her, some hidden, stubborn part of herself clawing desperately at the thing in her throat.
screaming wordlessly in her mind. Not me, not yet, not ever. The shadows paused, their chant faltering. You fight. Why fight? Alone is worse, she gasped, air tearing painfully into her lungs as her jaw slammed shut. The skeletal hands recoiled slightly, fingers curling in surprise. Her body convulsed violently, twisting mid-air as the cold within her belly flared brighter. Her fingernails dug into her palms until blood welled up, dripping in fat, dark drops onto the ash below. She felt her mouth open again, but this time it was her voice, weak and ragged but hers. Get out. The shadows hissed in unison, a sound like wind rushing through shattered glass. The skeletal hands lunged for her face again, but she twisted her head sharply, teeth snapping down hard on one of the fingers. A taste like burning copper filled her mouth, and the shadow shrieked, not aloud, but inside her skull, so loud it made her vision go white. The grip holding her aloft faltered. Her body dropped hard to the ashen ground, jarring her bones as she gasped in ragged lungfuls of air. The burned passengers wavered, their forms flickering like candles in a strong wind. She closes, she resists. Stop her. The voices screamed, overlapping and frantic, but the cold in her belly grew stronger now, spreading outward in steady pulses, and she clung to it like a lifeline. She pressed her bloody hands to her abdomen, whispering with all the strength she had left. Mine. This is mine. Her chest convulsed violently as a thick column of black smoke erupted from her mouth, coiling upward like a serpent before dissipating into the dark sky. The shadows recoiled, their forms splintering into jagged, broken outlines. No, door, stay open. The world tilted wildly as the ground beneath her began to quake. Fissures split the ashen plain, heat and light spilling up from the cracks like molten fire. The burned passengers screamed, not in words this time, but in raw animal agony, as their bodies crumbled into black dust. One by one they fell, their outstretched arms collapsing in silent pleas. The shadows writhed, shrinking, their voices fading into a static hiss. The skeletal hands reached for her one last time, grasping futilely at the air before disintegrating into a fine, oily mist. She pressed her forehead to the cooling ground, sobbing violently as the last whispers dissipated. We'll knock again, you'll answer again, you're still ours. Then silence.
The silence felt heavier than the screams that had filled the ash field moments before. It was a suffocating, unnatural stillness, broken only by her own ragged breaths. She lay sprawled on the cracked earth, her fingers clutching at fistfuls of soot, as though anchoring herself to a reality that kept slipping through her grasp. The cold that had flared inside her belly was fading now, replaced by a hollow ache, as if something vital had been torn away. Slowly, she pushed herself up onto her elbows, her arms trembling violently. The world around her seemed less solid, the jagged wreckage and churning skies flickering like a dying projection. With every blink, the black plane grew dimmer, the outlines of the burned passengers crumbling further into nothingness. For the first time, she realized she could no longer hear them. Their voices, their chanting, their knocks. It was just quiet, but it wasn't comforting. The quiet felt wrong, loaded with a weight that made her chest tighten. She staggered to her feet, nearly toppling as her knees buckled beneath her. Her clothes hung damp and heavy against her skin, reeking of smoke and iron. The air thinned around her as the world continued to distort, rippling violently like the surface of disturbed water. She blinked again, and for one brief moment she saw the hallway of her apartment beyond the wavering veil. The door, it was there, standing half open. Home. Her pulse spiked with a desperate, wild hope as she stumbled forward. Each step felt like wading through molasses, her feet dragging heavily through the softening ash. Almost there, almost there. She stretched out a shaking hand toward the door, and the shadows around her hissed faintly, soft, almost mournful. "You're still open." She gritted her teeth and forced herself onward, whispering to no one. Not anymore. But even as she said it, something deep inside whispered back, "Are you sure?" The final step was the hardest. She felt an almost physical resistance at the threshold, as though invisible hands clung to her arms and legs, pleading with her to stay. Her head pounded as faint voices slithered back into her ears. "Don't leave us. Don't shut the door." She shoved hard against the pull, her fingers gripping the frame of the apartment doorway until her nails cracked. With a scream that tore her throat raw, she hurled herself through. The air around her collapsed in an instant, and she hit the floor hard. The breath knocked out of her lungs. The familiar scent of dust and stale air filled her nose. She was back. She lay sprawled on the cold wooden floor of her apartment, staring at the ceiling in stunned silence. For a long moment, she didn't dare move. She could feel her chest rising and falling, feel her fingers twitching against the boards, and it was all hers. No voices, no shadows, just her. But the silence didn't last. From the corner of the room came a faint sound, a soft, deliberate knock. Knock. She froze, her eyes darting toward the sound. The closet door. It stood, slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness spilling into the room. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she pushed herself upright, every muscle screaming in protest. Another knock came, a little louder this time. Knock, then a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You didn't close it all the way." Her stomach twisted violently. She backed away, her heel catching on the edge of the rug as she scrambled toward the front door. But before she could reach it, a third knock sounded, slow, patient, almost playful. Knock. Her back hit the door frame, her hand fumbling for the lock. But deep inside her chest, she felt it, the faintest flutter, like fingers drumming lazily against bone. A chill raced down her spine as her trembling hands fell away from the lock. She pressed both palms flat to her sternum, feeling the hollow thump from within. Knock. And then the whisper came again, soft as smoke curling in the dark. "We came back with you." The first night back in her apartment felt like walking into a trap she couldn't see. She hadn't turned off the lights since she stumbled through the door hours ago, and now every bulb burned hot and buzzing in the silence, casting long, deep shadows that seemed to breathe with her. Sleep hovered at the edge of her mind, but fear kept tugging her awake, keeping her rooted in bed with blankets pulled up tight to her chin. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, the faint creak of the wooden floor as the building settled. But somewhere beneath those familiar noises came another sound, a sound she couldn't mistake. No matter how much she tried to convince herself, it was just her imagination. Knock, knock. 3 deliberate, evenly spaced raps coming from the closet door. She clutched the blanket tighter, her knuckles white, her breath catching in her chest as she stared at the crack of darkness between the door and the floor. The sound didn't come again, but the quiet that followed was worse somehow. It felt heavy, intentional, like something waiting. She forced her eyes shut, whispering to herself over and over, "It's not real, it's not real." But even in the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see it. the shadows pooling on the other side of the door, fingers tapping patiently. She didn't remember falling asleep, but she woke with a jolt. Hours later, her body damp with sweat, her heart thundering. The closet door was still shut, but now there were faint black handprints on the wood. The second night was worse. She had spent the entire day trying to convince herself she was imagining things, but she couldn't explain the handprints. No matter how hard she tried, she scrubbed them away with bleach until her hands were raw, only to find them smudged across the door again. Hours later, darker this time, as though pressed by hands still wet with soot. She barricaded the door with a chair and a stack of boxes, telling herself it would hold. But when the lights flickered at exactly 3:13 a.m., she knew it hadn't. The knocks started again, softer than the night before, but somehow closer, as if they weren't coming from behind the door anymore. Knock, knock, knock. She held her breath, lying rigid in the bed, as her ears strained for any other sound. And then she heard it, her name, whispered low and sweet from the foot of her bed. She felt the air stir near her face, as though someone had leaned in close, their cold breath ghosting across her skin. She didn't dare open her eyes, but the whisper came again, curling behind her ear this time. You left us. Don't leave us again. Her whole body tensed, a sob catching in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps retreating across the room. When she finally forced her eyes open, she saw the chair she'd wedged against the closet, lying neatly on its side. The door was ajar again. By the third night, she had stopped trying to sleep entirely. She sat huddled on the couch with every light in the apartment blazing, clutching a cold cup of coffee like a lifeline. Her phone was clutched in her lap, her thumb hovering over her sister's number. But she didn't press it. What would she say? That she was being haunted by voices and knocks? That something followed her back from the wreckage? She flinched at every sound, the plumbing creaking, the fridge humming, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. She hadn't eaten, hadn't showered. She was afraid to turn her back to any door or corner. Around 3 a.m., her phone buzzed suddenly. The screen lit up with her sister's name. Relief flared briefly in her chest as she swiped to answer. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice cracking. There was only static on the line, sharp and grating, and then a whisper threaded through it, faint but clear. "We're still in you." She threw the phone across the room with a strangled cry, the device shattering against the wall. Her heart slammed in her chest as her eyes darted wildly toward the closet. The door was wide open now. Darkness bled into the room like smoke, and from within came the faintest sound, tap, 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 as if fingers were drumming lazily on wood. The fourth night blurred into the fifth. She had stopped keeping track of time, her days melting together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Shadows lingered too long in the corners of her vision. Every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even the polished edge of a spoon, showed things she didn't want to see. Her reflection would smile when she didn't. Once, she caught sight of her own eyes flickering black in the bathroom mirror. She pressed her palms against the glass, whispering, "I'm still me, I'm still here." But her reflection didn't mimic her movement perfectly. It was delayed, as if hesitating to decide what to do. She stumbled back, knocking over a glass that shattered on the tile. As she bent to pick up the pieces, she noticed something horrifying. The shards were vibrating faintly. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to come from inside the glass itself. She froze, her fingers hovering above the jagged edges,
as a low hum filled the room. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, spreading across the apartment like rain drumming against windows, walls, even the floor beneath her feet. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound continued inside her head. Knock, knock. By the sixth night, her body felt like a foreign thing, heavy, sluggish, uncooperative. She hadn't eaten in days, and her skin was clammy and pale. Every so often she felt it again, a faint flutter beneath her ribs, like fingers brushing lazily against bone. She tried to tell herself it was just her heartbeat, but when she pressed her hand to her chest, the rhythm didn't match. It was slower, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. She curled up on the living room floor, pressing her palms hard against her sternum, as though she could trap whatever moved there. Tears streaked down her face as she whispered, "You can't have me, you can't." But deep down she wasn't sure that was true anymore. The air in the apartment grew heavier with each passing hour, a thick, oppressive weight that made her lungs burn. And sometimes, in the corner of her eye, she thought she saw them. Shadows, tall and thin, watching her from the edges of the room. They didn't move, they didn't speak. They just waited. The seventh night was when she heard them walking. It started as faint creaks in the hallway, the sound of bare feet padding slowly across the wooden floor. She froze on the couch, clutching the blanket tight around her, eyes fixed on the darkened hall. The footsteps drew closer, soft but deliberate, until they stopped just outside the living room. For a long moment, there was nothing, just silence, so thick it seemed to hum. Then came the whisper, low and tender, almost loving. "You're still open." She felt her stomach twist violently, bile rising in her throat as her hands flew to her chest. The faint drumming beneath her ribs returned, harder this time, like someone knocking from the inside. Knock, knock, knock. She pressed her back tight against the couch, shaking her head furiously as tears streamed down her face. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." But then came the soft sound of knuckles brushing wood, this time from the bedroom closet.
She hadn't turned off the lights in days. Every bulb in the apartment burned bright, but even the harsh fluorescence couldn't banish the creeping sense of darkness. It had settled into her bones, into the stale air, into the cracks between her heartbeat. She didn't know how long she'd been awake now. Sleep had become a distant memory, a luxury she no longer trusted. Every time her eyelids grew heavy, she would hear it, the faint, deliberate sound of knuckles brushing wood. Knock, knock, knock. It came from everywhere now. The closet, the walls, sometimes even the floor beneath her feet. It followed her like a pulse. Once she'd fled to the bathroom in a blind panic, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it. For a moment she thought she was safe. Then she heard the slow drag of fingers across the tile just outside. Her breath hitched as shadows bled under the door, curling like smoke. And then came the whisper, "There's nowhere to go, you're ours." She pressed her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth on the cold bathroom floor. Her reflection in the mirror above the sink was still watching her. Its eyes were darker than they should be, and when she blinked, it didn't. The next night, she found footprints in the hallway, blackened prints, as though left by something wet with soot. They trailed from the closet to her bedroom door, stopping right at the threshold. She stared at them in horror, her mind racing as she struggled to convince herself she hadn't been sleepwalking. But deep down, she knew better. The prints weren't hers. They were too large, too long. The toes splayed unnaturally, almost claw-like. She had scrubbed them away with scalding water and bleach, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the sponge. But by morning they had returned, darker this time, and there were more of them. They didn't stop at the bedroom threshold anymore. Now they circled her bed. She refused to sleep there after that. Instead, she curled up on the living room couch, clutching a kitchen knife in both hands. Her body ached from exhaustion, but every time her head dipped forward, she would hear the whisper, low, taunting, too close to be in her head. "You're so warm inside." She would bolt upright, the knife clutched tight, as she scanned the room with wild eyes. But there was never anyone there, just the faint scent of smoke, clinging stubbornly to the air. By the fourth day, things began to move. At first it was small, her coffee mug sliding an inch across the counter when she wasn't looking, the blinds swaying gently, even though no window was open. But soon it became undeniable. Her bedroom door slammed shut on its own while she was in the kitchen. Every cabinet in the apartment opened at once, in a violent clatter. She screamed, dropping to her knees, covering her ears as the knock started again, this time pounding from every surface. Knock, knock. They were in the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Even the light bulbs seemed to thrum with the sound, their glow flickering erratically. And then came the voices, layered and overlapping like a chorus. "You never closed us out. We never left." She crawled to the corner, clutching the knife to her chest, as tears streamed down her face. Her voice came out in a raw whisper, "Please, please, leave me alone." But the voices only laughed, the sound hollow and jagged like broken glass in a storm. "You brought us here. You're the door." On the sixth night, her phone rang again. It was her sister's number, though she hadn't touched the shattered device since it broke days ago. The screen was dark, dead, yet it vibrated violently on the floor, the cracked glass glowing faintly as the ringtone echoed in the suffocating silence. Against her better judgment, she reached for it with shaking fingers. As soon as her hand brushed the phone, it stopped ringing. The glow vanished, but before she could pull away, a voice rasped from the shattered speaker, "Let us out." She flung the phone across the room, her body trembling violently as she pressed her hands to her ears. But the voice wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was inside her head, curling like smoke around her thoughts. "We don't want to wait anymore." She squeezed her eyes shut, rocking back and forth in the corner. Her chest ached, a deep throbbing pressure building beneath her ribs. She could feel them now, not just knocking but pushing, testing her from the inside. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "I'm not a door," she whispered hoarsely. But even as she said it, she felt a faint flutter against her sternum, like fingers drumming lazily against bone. By the seventh night, she stopped recognizing herself. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror no longer moved in perfect sync. Sometimes its smile lingered too long, teeth stretching impossibly wide. Other times its eyes would flicker black, deep voids staring back at her with cold amusement. She smashed the mirror with her fist in a moment of blind panic, shards scattering across the tile. But even in the broken pieces, she still saw it, the wrongness in her own face, grinning up at her from a dozen fractured angles. The knocks didn't stop. They had grown louder now, more insistent, shaking the walls like a relentless drumbeat. Knock, knock. She pressed both hands flat to her chest, feeling the rhythm vibrating through her rib cage. Her skin felt hot, too tight,
like something beneath it was shifting, stretching. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. And then, in a voice not quite her own, she heard herself whisper, "They're almost through."
The walls of her apartment felt alive. Every surface seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with faint creaks, as if the building itself had become a ribcage holding something vast and patient. She stayed crouched in the corner of the living room, knees drawn tight to her chest, her eyes fixed on the closet door. It was closed again, but she no longer trusted it. She didn't remember shutting it. She didn't remember moving at all. The knocking had stopped hours ago, at least from the walls, but it hadn't left her. Now it came from somewhere deeper, echoing faintly inside her skull, like the beat of a second heart. Knock, knock, knock. Every thump sent a ripple through her chest, making her ribs ache, as though something was tapping them from beneath. She pressed her hands hard against her sternum, shaking her head violently, as if she could dislodge the sound. "You're not real," she whispered. But deep down, she wasn't sure anymore. What if she was wrong? What if she had brought them through with her that night? The thought settled like ice in her gut, and then came the whisper, low, guttural, curling up her spine from the inside, almost open. That night, the apartment shifted. At first it was subtle, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the walls, lights flickering in patterns that seemed deliberate. She thought she heard footsteps pacing in the hallway, slow and methodical, but when she peeked from behind the couch, she saw no one. Then came the smell, acrid and smoky, tinged with the coppery tang of blood. It seeped into her nostrils, thick and cloying. She stumbled to the kitchen, her vision swimming, and froze. The cabinets hung wide open, their contents strewn across the floor, plates shattered, utensils bent at impossible angles. Across the fridge door was smudged black fingerprints spelling two words in jagged strokes. "Lettuce." She backed away, nearly tripping over the broken dishes. A low hum filled her ears, vibrating her teeth. She clamped her hands over her ears, tears stinging her eyes. But even then the sound persisted, inside her head now. Louder, faster. Knock, knock. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, her body racked with a violent shudder. "We don't want the door anymore. We want the whole house." Sleep took her like a predator, sudden and cruel. She awoke sprawled on the floor. Hours later, the taste of ash in her mouth, her clothes damp with cold sweat. Something felt wrong. The air was heavier than before, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. She tried to rise, but her limbs felt foreign, sluggish. When she caught her reflection in the window, she saw why. Her eyes, they weren't entirely hers anymore. Black veins spider-webbed out from her irises, pulsing faintly like cracks in glass. She stumbled back with a strangled cry, her heel catching on a loose floorboard. The sound echoed louder than it should have, and from beneath her feet came a knock, sharp and impatient. Knock, knock. She froze as a whisper slithered up through the floorboards, brushing her ear. "Why fight? You're hollow now." She clutched at her head, rocking violently, as a new voice joined the first, lower and angrier. "You can't stop us. You let us in." The knocks grew frenzied that night, pounding in a chaotic rhythm that made the walls tremble and the light bulbs burst one by one. Darkness consumed the apartment in seconds, broken only by the faint red glow seeping from the closet door. She backed into a corner, clutching her chest as her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The knocking wasn't just sound anymore. She could feel it beneath her skin, fingers pushing, probing, testing for weak spots. Her ribs ached, stretching subtly outward, as if something inside was pressing for release. She let out a strangled sob as a sharp crack echoed through her body. One rib shifted violently, jutting out under her flesh like a trapped blade. "No, no, no, no," she whimpered, but the voices only laughed, echoing around her in a chilling chorus. Almost through, almost home. A shadow peeled itself from the corner of the ceiling, slithering toward her on elongated limbs. Its hands reached for her face, its fingers black and smoking. She wanted to scream, but no sound came, her throat too tight, too full. She crawled backward blindly, her palms scraping against the splintered floorboards as the shadow closed in. The air grew thick, each breath feeling like inhaling smoke. Her head lulled back against the wall, her vision narrowing. She could feel them now writhing under her skin, sliding up her throat. A cold, slick pressure brushed the back of her teeth. Her jaw ached, as though it were being pried open from within. Almost open, almost open, the voices chanted, each syllable vibrating her bones. She slammed her palms against her chest, screaming silently inside her own mind. "I'm still here, this is still my body." A flicker of resistance surged in her gut, cold and sharp like a knife. The voices hissed in unison, "Close and you'll be alone forever." Her eyes fluttered shut as tears streamed down her cheeks, and she whispered, barely audible, "Better alone than hollow." Then something shifted. A searing cold flared deep inside her belly, spreading outward in jagged pulses. The hands reaching for her face recoiled, fingers curling as though burned. The shadows shuddered violently, their forms splintering. A scream, high and inhuman, ripped through the apartment, vibrating the walls. The knocking faltered, stuttering unevenly before stopping altogether. She collapsed onto her side, gasping, clutching at her chest, as her ribs slowly sank back into place, with nauseating cracks. The air cleared slightly, though the stench of smoke lingered faintly. For a moment, she thought it was over. She lay trembling, her cheek pressed against the cold floor, too weak to move. But then came the whisper, softer than before, almost tender. "We'll wait. You'll knock first next time." The apartment felt tighter now, as if the walls had inched closer in the night, their edges pressing against her ribs from all directions. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. Every time she let her eyes close, she felt them shifting inside her, pressing against her organs, sliding like wet hands under her skin. Knock, knock. The sound no longer came from the closet or the walls. It came from her chest, each knock deep and deliberate, vibrating her bones. She had stopped crying hours ago. There were no tears left, just a hollow ache and a voice looping endlessly in her mind. "You let us in, let us out." She pressed herself against the living room wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest, rocking slightly as her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She didn't remember how long it had been since she last ate or drank. Her body felt alien now, stiff and heavy, her skin tingling with each faint movement beneath the surface. She whispered to herself, her voice shaking, "I'm not a door, I'm not a door." But deep down, she didn't believe it anymore. Then came the first crack, a sharp, wet sound from deep within her sternum, like ice splitting under pressure. Pain lanced through her chest, doubling her over as she clawed at her ribcage. She felt it then, something hard pressing upward against her ribs, testing their strength. Her breath hitched violently as her fingers trembled over her skin, feeling the faintest bulge shifting beneath. "No," she sobbed. "No, no, no, no." The whispers rose into a chorus, dozens of voices tangled together, some pleading, some laughing, some screaming. "You're already open. We're almost through." The apartment lights flared and burst, plunging her into suffocating darkness. A low rumble echoed from the walls, deep and hungry like a beast stirring after a long sleep. She staggered to her feet, clutching the wall for balance, as she stumbled blindly toward the door. Each step sent a fresh jolt of pain through her body. The thing inside her pressed harder, its movements frantic now. It was coming. The air thickened, turning hot and humid like a tomb. Shadows curled across the floor, stretching impossibly long, hands reaching for her ankles. She kicked free, her breath rasping in her throat as she lunged for the front door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat. Behind her, the closet door creaked open slowly, a darkness deeper than night spilling out across the room. From within came a voice so loud it rattled her skull. "Let us out." The knocking became a pounding, her ribcage rattling violently, as if fists were hammering from inside. "Knock, knock," she screamed, wrenching the door open and spilling into the hallway beyond. Cold air rushed against her skin like a slap, but even here she wasn't free. The walls of the corridor shimmered faintly, the paint blistering and cracking in patterns that almost resembled faces screaming in silent agony. She ran anyway, her bare feet slapping against the linoleum as doors blurred past on either side. The whispers followed, chasing her like a storm wind. "You can't leave. You're the vessel. We're coming too." Her body buckled halfway down the hall. She crashed to her knees, her hands clawing at her chest as a sharp, splintering sensation tore through her ribs. Something long and black pressed upward, stretching her skin taut. She choked on a sob, her fingers digging so deep they drew blood. "Get out," she rasped. "Get out of me." The voices hissed in her ears. "We are you. There is no out." A handprint bloomed across her stomach, black and smoldering, fingers splayed wide, as if something inside was trying to claw its way through. She staggered upright with a scream, lurching forward on unsteady legs. The stairwell was ahead. If she could make it outside, if she could just get into open air, maybe she could shake them loose. Maybe. She burst through the stairwell door, stumbling down the steps two at a time, her hands gripping the railing as vertigo threatened to send her tumbling. The walls pulsed around her like living flesh, faint knocks echoing from within the concrete. Knock, knock. She pressed a fist to her chest as a deep, guttural moan vibrated her sternum. The voices screamed in unison. "Don't shut us out." Her vision blurred with tears as she hit the ground floor, slamming her shoulder into the exit bar of the building's main door. Cool night air hit her face like salvation. She staggered outside, collapsing onto the cracked pavement, her palms scraping against rough asphalt. For the first time in days, she took a deep breath. The air was clean, quiet, no knocks, no whispers, just her own gasping sobs. She had made it out. She was free, or so she thought. A faint sound made her blood run cold. Knock, 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 knock. Not from the building behind her, not from the street, but from her own chest, slow and deliberate, vibrating her ribs from within. She pressed both hands flat to her sternum, tears streaking her face as her breath caught. And then came the whisper, soft as silk, curling up her throat like smoke. The apartment felt tighter now, as if the walls had inched closer in the night, their edges pressing against her ribs from all directions. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. Every time she let her eyes close, she felt them shifting inside her, pressing against her organs, sliding like wet hands under her skin. Knock, knock. The sound no longer came from the closet or the walls. It came from her chest, each knock deep and deliberate, vibrating her bones. She had stopped crying hours ago. There were no tears left, just a hollow ache and a voice looping endlessly in her mind. You let us in, let us out. She pressed herself against the living room wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest, rocking slightly as her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She didn't remember how long it had been since she last ate or drank. Her body felt alien now, stiff and heavy, her skin tingling with each faint movement beneath the surface. She whispered to herself, her voice shaking, "I'm not a door, I'm not a door." But deep down, she didn't believe it anymore. Then came the first crack. A sharp, wet sound from deep within her sternum, like ice splitting under pressure. Pain lanced through her chest, doubling her over as she clawed at her ribcage. She felt it then, something hard pressing upward against her ribs, testing their strength. Her breath hitched violently as her fingers trembled over her skin, feeling the faintest bulge shifting beneath. "No," she sobbed. "No, no, no, no." The whispers rose into a chorus, dozens of voices tangled together, some pleading, some laughing, some screaming. "You're already open. We're almost through." The apartment lights flared and burst, plunging her into suffocating darkness. A low rumble echoed from the walls, deep and hungry like a beast stirring after a long sleep. She staggered to her feet, clutching the wall for balance, as she stumbled blindly toward the door. Each step sent a fresh jolt of pain through her body. The thing inside her pressed harder, its movements frantic now. It was coming. The air thickened, turning hot and humid like a tomb. Shadows curled across the floor, stretching impossibly long, hands reaching for her ankles. She kicked free, her breath rasping in her throat as she lunged for the front door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat. Behind her, the closet door creaked open slowly, a darkness deeper than night spilling out across the room. From within came a voice so loud it rattled her skull. "Let us out." The knocking became a pounding, her ribcage rattling violently, as if fists were hammering from inside. "Knock, knock," she screamed, wrenching the door open and spilling into the hallway beyond. Cold air rushed against her skin like a slap, but even here she wasn't free. The walls of the corridor shimmered faintly, the paint blistering and cracking in patterns that almost resembled faces screaming in silent agony. She ran anyway, her bare feet slapping against the linoleum as doors blurred past on either side. The whispers followed, chasing her like a storm wind. "You can't leave. You're the vessel. We're coming too." Her body buckled halfway down the hall. She crashed to her knees, her hands clawing at her chest as a sharp, splintering sensation tore through her ribs. Something long and black pressed upward, stretching her skin taut. She choked on a sob, her fingers digging so deep they drew blood. "Get out," she rasped. "Get out of me." The voices hissed in her ears. "We are you. There is no out." A handprint bloomed across her stomach, black and smoldering, fingers splayed wide, as if something inside was trying to claw its way through. She staggered upright with a scream, lurching forward on unsteady legs. The stairwell was ahead. If she could make it outside, if she could just get into open air, maybe she could shake them loose. Maybe she burst through the stairwell door, stumbling down the steps 2 at a time, her hands gripping the railing as vertigo threatened to send her tumbling. The walls pulsed around her like living flesh, faint knocks echoing from within the concrete. Knock, knock. She pressed a fist to her chest as a deep, guttural moan vibrated her sternum. The voices screamed in unison. "Don't shut us out." Her vision blurred with tears as she hit the ground floor, slamming her shoulder into the exit bar of the building's main door. Cool night air hit her face like salvation. She staggered outside, collapsing onto the cracked pavement, her palms scraping against rough asphalt. For the first time in days, she took a deep breath. The air was clean, quiet, no knocks, no whispers, just her own gasping sobs. She had made it out. She was free, or so she thought. A faint sound made her blood run cold. Knock, 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 knock. Not from the building behind her, not from the street, but from her own chest, slow and deliberate, vibrating her ribs from within. She pressed both hands flat to her sternum, tears streaking her face as her breath caught. And then came the whisper, soft as silk, curling up her throat like smoke. And so she thought she escaped. But sometimes, escaping isn't freedom. It's an invitation for something far darker to follow you out. The knocking may have stopped, for now, but somewhere deep inside, it waits, watching, listening, waiting for the moment you stop listening. What if it's already knocking in your own walls, or maybe from under your skin? If this story kept you on edge, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe now for more chilling tales and in-depth explorations of the strange, the horrifying, and the unexplained. Don't miss the next chapter, because the knocking, it never really ends.